I'm happy to, in the name of the Global Diwan, to welcome our speakers and our participants for this new chapter about oil, gas, and renewable energies. So today we will try to give you information and to have a full discussion about the perspective of this energy sector in the Middle East. But first of all, I would ask the panelists to make a short presentation of who they are, their short bio. And ladies first, I will ask Mona to present herself.
Thank you, Eric. I'm a political risk consultant working on East Med gas resources within political risk consultancy, Middle East strategic perspectives. I'm also pursuing a PhD thesis on the same subject, the management of gas sector in Lebanon, Israel, and Cyprus.
And you are located in Beirut.
I'm based in Beirut. Yep.
Yes, and you are a member of the Beirut Energy Club, which is
exactly.
a partner for the Global Diwan and friends.
So honored to be a partner with you on this event.
Thank you, Mona, to be with us. Maybe Alexandre, I see you on the screen, so you can say a few words about what you are in Paris, but maybe you can introduce yourself quickly.
Hello, everybody. I am Alexandre Kateb. I am an economist with a specialization in financial economics. I have founded a research site called the Multipolarity Report, which I invite you to visit, multipolarity.report. And I recently published a book on a changing model of development for the Middle East and North Africa. And
we can see the book on the screen.
Indeed, and my editor told me you have to communicate more on your book, you have to promote it more, so that's what I'm trying to do, basically.
Yeah, we'll be happy to read it.
Thank you.
I will ask our friend from Kuwait, Amro, to say a few words about himself, and then we will give the floor to Yesar and go back to Amro for the first speech of this day.
My name is Amro Heikal. I've been working in the oil and gas industry for 27 years now. My focus was mainly on the development and the operation of solutions that could contribute to the reduction of environmental impact of using the oil industry. Recently, my project won the Gold Stevie Award in 2020. I'm a fellow at the Royal Society of Chemistry. I'm a charter chemist, a charter manager. I'm also full member of the Sigma XI, the scientific society in US. And recently, I've been awarded as a registered scientist in UK.
Thank you, Amro. You are among the panel, the specialist, the expert, the engineer, and you will provide us with technical information to be the background of our panel today. Yesar, you are in Paris, you have studied in Paris, but you are from Iraq. Say a few words about you, please.
Thank you very much for hosting everybody here. My name is Yesar Al-Maleki. I'm an energy economist, geopolitical analyst specializing in the Gulf and Iraq. Also the managing director of the Iraq Energy Institute in Baghdad, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC. I also study at Sciences Po PSIA, Paris School of International Affairs, usually between Paris and Baghdad. Originally a petroleum engineer, very close to the industry, and specializing in the Gulf and Iraq in terms of economics, risk, security, and so on. Pleasure to be here, by the way.
Thank you, Yesar, to join us. So as an introduction, I will say that our big question is what will be the international energy market in, we'll say, the next decade. There's a weaker oil price environment. There's energy transition with appearing in the discussions. Gas demand will probably grow to the 2040 and more. We can ask us, or we will ask you about the technical solution to reduce, to recycle, and to reuse energy. And in the context of a climate risk and change, of course, that can be probably underpriced in the recent studies. And we'll finish with solar, wind, renewable energies. Can they make a big counterpart in the next years facing oil and gas demand? I will leave the floor to Amro. He has some slides to show, explaining more technically what is this petrol and oil sector in a global presentation on economic and also technical aspects. Amro, if you want to share your PowerPoint with us and the floor. So there's 10 slides that we will see and that Amro will comment.
Can you see it now?
We see your screen, but maybe not exactly. We see the slides separately. No, it's not appearing on the screen. Maybe you can comment if your PowerPoint is not appearing on the shared screen. Ah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
You have 10 minutes.
Yes. Okay. Out of the world energy production, the fossil fuel, which is oil, coal, and natural gas, is about 64%. The hydropower is about 15.8. The nuclear is 10. Renewable energy, which is the wind, solar, and tidal, and geothermal, is about 9.3, and other is 0.6. How the Middle East dominates the oil market. As you can see, out of total production of 1.734 billion barrels, the Middle East is about 48.1%. South and Central America, which is mainly would be Venezuela and Brazil, 18.7, North America, 14.1, and the Commonwealth is 8.4, Africa, 7.2. Mainly Africa is the deep water production, Asia Pacific 2.6, and Europe 0.8. To give you an outlook how the oil compared by other earth materials, you know, the gold is about 170 billion, iron 115, copper 91 billion, and while the oil is 1,720 billion, which is all minerals combined will be even less than the oil market itself. Which countries are most dependable on oil revenue? As you can see here, it's an approximate data. Iraq is close to 45%, Kuwait nearly the same, Libya also nearly the same, Saudi Arabia falls close to 30%, Oman also 30%, and would be the last is Iran, which is close to 17, 18%. how the oil is used. The oil is used through the refineries when it get extracted from the wells. It goes to refineries and then it goes to into a heat process and it gets separated. The lighter materials get separated by less heat, and then by high heat you get the heavy gas oil, and you can see here in this diagram, you know, the different uh, materials separation. Oil is in our daily life in everything we use, from the cooking pan, the measurement tapes, the paint brushes, sunglasses, um, yeah, sport boots, everything, even CDs.
Mhm.
In our home, in our home, oil goes into a lot of items, from the beach umbrella to the guitar strings, the ice chest, the vinyl flooring, plastic toys, synthetic fibers for you know, cushions and sofas. A lot of things is in our daily life. Renewable energy. The renewable energy is generally defined as energy that comes from resources which are naturally replenished on a human timescale, such as sunlight, wind, rain, tidal waves, and geothermal heat. For this reason, they are sometimes called infinite energy resources. Some people, they like to put the biofuel within the renewable energy. Personally, I do not, for many reasons. How the Middle East is falling behind the renewable. At the current status of Middle East for renewable energy, as per uh, 2019 energy consumption, is way behind the world. It's close to 1%, while you can see Brazil is very close to 16%, the European Union moving fast. Uh, you know, it was uh, about 12%. The future is bright as per the government in the Middle East announcement. They and their project planning. They say that up to 2035 they will go combined together up to 200 um, gigawatts. So we just keep watch and see how they will do. I would like to say that the main drive for the Middle East to get out of the umbrella of depending on totally on oil, they have to spend more money on their R&D. Currently, the Middle East R&D contribution compared to by the world is less than 3%. The only company registered within the top 1,000 companies is Sabak, Saudi Arabia. So really, they need to spend much more. Saudi Arabia in 2016, they announced that they are going to spend 334 billion until 2025 just to maintain oil capacity. So for sure, out of this number, they can take a part and use it in their R&D to develop more industry that can actually use the crude oil itself, not, not for the, as we explained, we use the crude oil in many aspects of our life. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amro. You have been working as a drilling engineer for maybe more than 20 years now. You have experience, and I will say, I will ask you if you have seen in this period important dramatic changes in the technology, and are you hoping that new research and development will provide more easy drillings and exploitation of these natural resources?
Yes, of course. You know, the you can see there is a lot of development, especially in Saudi Arabia. So Aramco have one of the biggest research institute in the whole area, just to improve the production capacity, and they managed to reduce their wells cost dramatically by using different new technologies. The new technology can go into many things, from the start of the well to the end of the well, where they use the completion to get the oil out, uh, for the refinery process. So definitely we can see a lot of improvement happened the last few years.
Okay, thank you. It's a smooth transition to give the floor to Mona. We will have an overview of the new potential exploitation in the Levant, around Lebanon and on the East Mediterranean. And then I will ask the same question to Yesar, that he will probably more inform us about the potential in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf region. Mona, it's your turn now to inform us about your researchers in Beirut.
Thank you, Eric. Well, there's a sort of a contrast between the hype that surrounds gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean and difficulties in being able to monetize at least some of these resources. 2020 has been a rough year for East Med gas. It started off with a promising outlook. Leviathan was brought on stream on the last day of 2019. Israel started exporting significant volumes of gas to Jordan and Egypt in January. A series of drillings were scheduled offshore Cyprus and Lebanon, and the second licensing round in Lebanon was awaiting bids. But then the COVID-19 crisis swept across the industry. It was reflected at our own small level with the postponement of all drillings offshore Cyprus and the second drilling offshore Lebanon in Block 9 after a first disappointing well in Block 4. The licensing round in Lebanon was postponed to a date to be determined later in 2021. The Karish development project in Israel suffered some delays as well. In addition, Egypt halted LNG exports from Itku for several months because prices were too low. But ironically, it was also a year that brought the spotlights back onto the region in a rather unusual way. Over the past year, we've seen more assertive claims and counterclaims over maritime zones. We've seen maritime border agreements, some of which have no recognized legal basis. We've seen a multiplication of reconnaissance and drilling activities that were denounced by many for their illegality. We even had a naval showdown back in August. So against this backdrop, it was easy to make the shortcut and interpret events as a race behind gas resources. Energy was seen as the real stake behind this mobilization of various actors. And it was probably the trigger. Energy brought attention back to maritime borders and zones, which have become a sort of rediscovered space, an expression used to refer to borders in spaces that were remobilized by the state due to changing geopolitical circumstances. In this case, the first offshore discoveries towards the end of the 1990s triggered an interest in offshore exploration in the region and in delimiting maritime boundaries to enable further exploration. This in turn created overlapping claims and revived long-standing disputes over how maritime zones should be delimited. So offshore resources brought the attention back to this rediscovered space and created new dynamics. But this is not a dispute over resources, but a dispute over sovereignty, borders, and influence. Back to the region's offshore resources, the biggest challenge for East Med Gas is finding markets where it can be competitive. Much of these offshore resources, especially those in Israel and Cyprus, were discovered in deep waters and are complex and expensive to develop. It took a decade, for example, to achieve first gas from Leviathan, Israel's largest gas field. And 9 years after the first Cypriot discovery, Aphrodite, and 2 additional discoveries since then, Calypso and Glafkos, Cyprus has yet to exploit its offshore resources. Multiple other factors like insufficient infrastructure, limited local markets, of course I'm talking outside Egypt, geopolitical tensions, and even sometimes the management of the sector at a national level all add to these challenges and complicate the monetization process further. You could also add decarbonization policies, which will only make it harder to reach certain markets, and the growing trend, especially in Europe, towards imposing stricter criteria for funding energy projects, the kind of projects we might need in the region to further develop the sector. So we have a competitiveness issue, and that is why the biggest challenge for East Med Gas is finding markets where it can be competitive. So what are these markets? Technically speaking, local and regional markets represent the most reasonable destination. They are also markets with less CO2 concerns, as Jonathan Stern puts it, at least compared to other regions. The closest markets within reach, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Turkey, consumed over 115 BCM of natural gas last year. The small Cypriot and Lebanese markets plan to start importing natural gas over the next few years, while demand in Syria is expected to recover with the post-war reconstruction. So gas demand is expected to grow at a robust pace, despite the potential adoption of energy efficiency measures and a higher penetration of renewables. There are plans to increase the share of natural gas in the power generation mix across the region, while industrial, residential, and transportation gas use is also set to grow, even if at a more modest pace. The 2 heavyweights when it comes to natural gas consumption in the region are Turkey and Egypt, followed by Israel. Now, the last 2 largely rely on domestically produced gas. When it comes to Egypt supply-demand balance over the coming few years, the picture is a bit unclear. On one hand, Egypt has a fast-growing population and faces high decline rates at its already producing fields. But Cairo is also looking at expanding exploration activities in its promising Western Mediterranean and Red Sea acreages, which it may be able to offset declining fields over the coming years. But for now, supplies are expected to exceed domestic demand until the mid-2020s, after which Egypt might need to resume imports again unless additional discoveries can start production. So this leaves the Turkish market, which imports the bulk of its natural gas consumption as the region's heavyweight, particularly as contracts for about 45 BCM per year are due to expire by 2026, if I'm not mistaken. Back in August, Turkey announced the discovery of Tuna 1 in the Black Sea, which has an estimated potential in excess of 400 BCM of natural gas. It's not clear at this point if these estimates are recoverable figures, but if and when production starts, it may displace a portion of gas imports. How large a portion this is remains unclear at this point. In the meantime, the Turkish market remains hard to ignore for offshore East Med gas producers who face real challenges in finding markets where their gas can be competitive. But of course, equally hard to ignore are the geopolitical tensions that stand in the way. For more distant markets, a pipeline to Europe faces significant economic and geopolitical obstacles, which makes LNG a more reasonable, though ambitious, aspiration. But here too, exporting significant volumes of LNG in the future requires serious efforts from the part of companies and governments alike to render East Med gas competitive in global markets. From the part of companies, the key is to bring upstream costs down and to find common grounds via, for example, creating synergies via joint development with other companies operating in the region, which are also potential competitors. According to a study prepared for the World Bank, prices at the wellhead within the region need to be below $3 per MMBTU to enable the gas to be competitive. This is, of course, an ambitious target, given prices at the wellhead for most deep water gas fields in the region. To date, on paper, the least complicated way for East Med gas to reach global markets remains via Egypt's LNG terminals. From the part of governments, a wide range of efforts is needed as well, from proposing competitive fiscal frameworks to liberalizing markets and opening access to relevant infrastructure, encouraging regional cooperation, and so on. Egypt appears to be at the center of this envisioned configuration, thanks to its location, to its large gas infrastructure, and good relations with pretty much all its neighbors. But turning vision into reality requires Cairo to pursue sector reforms, including the liberalization of its gas market and a reconsideration of its pricing schemes to encourage the import of natural gas from nearby fields and re-export it within the region and beyond via its large gas infrastructure. These, of course, are daunting tasks. If the stars align, the end result might unlock the region's offshore gas wealth by improving their competitiveness. Clearly, there is a need for a regionally coordinated effort to unlock the full potential of the Eastern Mediterranean offshore gas wealth. I say full because part of it is already being developed. Interestingly, a platform was recently established to coordinate exactly such efforts, the East Med Gas Forum. But will it be able to live up to its potential, considering the challenges it faces, including geopolitical challenges? At this point, it's too early to tell. Of course, it's an encouraging first step to have such a platform, but I guess that ultimately it must be scaled up and probably even be more inclusive to fully achieve its potential.
Thank you. Thank you, Mona. I will ask you a question. Could you explain us what in the neighboring countries of this region, you have fully explained who they are and what role they play, what the big companies exploiting the resources, and if there are companies from Europe, United States, or from the Gulf who are operating or who wish to operate in this new wells and new drilling zone?
Sure. We have an interesting array of companies. First, Noble Energy pretty much put the East Med on the exploration map with a series of discoveries over the past 2 decades, including Tamar and Leviathan in Israel and Aphrodite in Cyprus. We also have a remarkable presence for Italy's Eni across the region in Egypt, Cyprus, and Lebanon. Eni discovered the largest gas field in the region, Zohr, offshore Egypt, and also has an interesting discovery in Cyprus as well, Calypso. Total has also an interesting presence. It was a bit hesitant at first. It probably still is, but the East Med has gradually grown on Total, I guess, with stakes in Cyprus, Egypt, and Lebanon, oftentimes in partnership with Eni. Exxon is present in Cyprus's Block 10, which was previously licensed to Total, and where Exxon recently made a discovery, Glafkos, along with its partner Qatar Petroleum. Shell has stakes in Egypt, and with its acquisition of BG, it acquired a stake in Aphrodite in Cyprus. We also have a new entrant this year. American major Chevron has acquired stakes in Egypt, and via its acquisition of Noble Energy, it also inherited stakes in Israel and Cyprus. The interesting point here is that having various assets across the region could help in enhancing prospects for monetization if synergies can be made.
So there's no monopoly, there's a full diversification of big companies in the region. Thank you, Mona.
Exactly.
You will speak
Thank you, Eric.
later. We will move from the sea to the continent and go quickly to Baghdad, where Yesar will provide us with his analysis from the Iraqi Energy Institute that he is managing. Yesar, I don't know if you have slides or not.
I do. So let me share my screen.
Okay.
Sorry.
Nice picture.
Oh, thank you. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, it's okay.
Perfect. So again, thank you very much for having us all here today. My part is going to go through the GCC region and the broader Arab oil exporters or producers, inclusive of Iraq itself. So basically, I have 6 key takes to give in 12 minutes. First of all, looking at the unprecedented impact that COVID-19 has on the economies of these oil-dependent countries, the priorities of today, how they are preceding the future stability of these economies, what are the preconditions for economic diversification, how to grow a private sector, and the planning for a diversified economy. And then we are going to look at a few of the prospects for energy integration throughout the region. So to start first, the oil industry globally is going through one of the gravest crises in the last 100 years. So the GCC, Iraq, and the rest of the Arab oil exporters are dependent on economic revenues that come from oil sales. In this year, we have seen demand of oil falling by 18%. And at the same time, we have seen the oil price losing almost 70% of its value throughout the year. Now, on the 20th of April of this year, what we have seen is, for the first time, negative oil prices as WTI went to negative $38 per barrel. And that has to do with a number of factors: the falling demand, the fact that storage capacity offshore and onshore was full, and at the same time, we had traders panicking on markets, and that was a big problem. So this is unprecedented. As I said, in the last 17 years, the oil price hasn't reached this level before, as we can see from the figure on my right-hand side. But at the same time, we need to see how this pressure is mounting on the GCC economies themselves. So as the world today goes into stay-at-home rules, movement restrictions, lockdown, this is affecting the global oil demand. So it is not coming back as fast as many of OPEC members and Arab oil exporters wish it could. And this is also impacting the global economic recovery. And this is why Saudi Arabia, for example, Iraq and other major producers in the region are pushing for an extension of the OPEC plus cuts, for instance. But what about the global GDP? We see the global GDP going negatively by 3% this year. And the MENA region and the Middle East itself is going in parallel with that estimate. So because the economies are correlated with macroeconomic changes in the world. So throughout the region, we see the same kind of negative -3% contraction in the economies. However, if you look at the three key oil producers in the GCC, and beyond. So you have the Saudis, they are going to do a bit better than others. So contraction there in terms of GDP is going to be estimated at -2.3%. While the Emiratis, for instance, Abu Dhabi, the UAE is contracting above the average at around 3.5%. But you go look into other countries with weaker economic fundamentals like Iraq, which is wholly dependent on oil almost, you see that contraction going all the way to 9%. And this is problematic. So the figure on the right here shows the different contraction in GDP for different oil exporters in the region. At the same time, this takes a toll on national oil companies and international oil companies, not just the ones operating in the region itself, but also the ones operating throughout the world. Across the board, what we are seeing is a combined revenue losses for NOCs and IOCs of almost 40%. So lost revenue. You look at the region itself in terms of the oil industry, so in the Middle East. In the 2019, you look at, the global industry itself, 2.47 trillion, and that is going to be going down all the way to $1.47 trillion. And this figure is quite similar to some of the national oil revenues that are getting lost in the region. So for instance, Iraq has lost almost 47% of its revenues this year. And in terms of the CapEx and OpEx cuts for most of these companies, they have slashed them by 20%. And this has effects. Maybe Amro can, give more details about this in terms of the technicalities, but long-term production from all these fields is going to be impacted. At the same time, there will be mitigation for future exploration in the region. There are going to be some disruptions to supply chains, infrastructure projects, pipelines, new wells, depots, export terminals, even downstream projects. All of these are going to be impacted. Distribution chains are going to be broken and they have to be built back again. Then you add to that another important factor, which is the curbing of innovation, digitization, all these technologies that were supposed to make production more efficient. Many of these companies will see these as a luxury and they will have to cut down on them. And also this impacts the stakeholders, not just the government, but also private sector actors in the region who depend on the oil industry directly or indirectly on governments that redistribute the oil rent or oil revenues into the private sector itself. But we have also to understand this, how these economies are actually built on oil. So oil contribution in most of the GCC in terms of fiscal revenues is above 50%. The single exception to this is actually the United Arab Emirates. So that is at 35%. You take Iraq as another example, and it is actually 93% of fiscal revenues. And this impacts the fiscal break-even prices. Most of the time, all these countries, they come up with unrealistic fiscal break-even oil prices. And up until today, even as we are still within the crisis, they haven't been able to readjust those expectations in terms of oil price. Now, it is very important to put a figure here. In this year, combined GCC countries and Iraq. They are estimated to have lost $190 billion of oil revenues altogether. And that is very problematic. Right. So let's have a little summary of what's happening. We have causes, we have effects. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have declining oil prices. Because of that, we have a price war that preceded that between Russia and Saudi Arabia. And we also have weak existing economic structures. So what are the effects that we see today? Economic contraction, fiscal stimulus packages that these governments are trying to put in order to readjust the economies. We have some short-term measures. Fiscal buffers are being eroded. They are trying to rebuild them back, but they only think that will happen in the future, in the next 1 year or 2 years. And then we have also a big problem, especially for financial centers like the UAE, where we have a lot of debt and capital flight. So just a few fast figures here on the Arab region as a whole and this region. So 152 billion losses in real GDP throughout the Arab region, 190 billion, as we said, in oil revenues losses. 14.3 million people are pushed to poverty. 55 million of those are vulnerable people, and 26 million people are facing the risk of displacement, especially in the Levant, in Iraq, and in crisis-prone areas of the region. Then we also, I'm sorry, I have this little window for Zoom that I have to move around. 420 billion lost in market capital, and that is very important. This will affect the private sector. And by the end of the year, many see at least 1.7 million jobs to be lost. 23% losses in terms of stock markets. So what have the governments been doing? So there have been two kind of policies. You have immediate policy responses, and we saw that in the first half of the year. Basically, put as much money as you can into the healthcare sector in order to make sure that you have resources to fight COVID-19, support vulnerable households, people with lower incomes, liquidity provision from central banks to the banking industry, fiscal budget adjustments, cutting operating expenditures here and there, and also, most importantly, investment budgets for national countries. And you can see that especially in Saudi Arabia, where many infrastructure projects have been cancelled. And this, in a way, affects the private industry itself, which is dependent on that. Then you have some facilities, deferrals of taxes, credit lines, and utility holidays. Now, limited foreign exchange interventions and VAT increases. So we have seen VATs established in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other GCC countries at 5%, 10%. This is the beginning of it, but as the economic sense of these VATs become relevant and seen, then maybe they will go into more measures like income taxes and others. And that is a problem, especially for the United Arab Emirates, a country that is built around the fact that it is a tax-free haven. Now, there are supportive policies, short to mid-term, gradual removal of emergency support that was at the beginning of the year. So we are seeing that. Workforce reallocation through different sectors, tackling poverty and inequality, keeping businesses open, as we have seen in Dubai, for instance, where there is a scheme for businesses to stay open and salaries to be paid by the government, but that is also limited. Now, capital outflow measures, limits on how much dollars are leaving the region. And eventually, what they want to see, all of these countries, is rebuilding their fiscal buffers. However, when you look at all of this, we are not taking the long-term structural economic changes that we would like to see. So is there a wasted opportunity here? Well, first of all, we need to understand what are the preconditions for economic diversification. Everyone is talking about economic diversification in the region. This is normal in historical sense. Most of the GCC countries, Iraq and other oil-producing countries in the region, even Iran, they talk about economic diversification when you have a downturn in oil price. Once you have a windfall in revenues and higher oil prices, everybody forgets about economic diversification. So what do we need? Well, these countries need to develop fiscal frameworks with short and long-term objectives based on fiscal rules. Adapt to transparency, especially when it comes to oil revenues, and this is always problematic and a big challenge in these countries. Enhancing liquidity management, forecasting, and interbank market operations, very important, especially in the GCC. There had been a lot of progress on this. Building regulatory, supervisory, and macro-prudential frameworks to ensure financial sector resilience, especially to oil price volatility. So banks need to have the capital and the lending capacity to private businesses, especially when the oil price is low. And of course, adopt fairly valued, real effective exchange rates. Up until now, this is not really happening. We do not see much floating exchange rates, but this is something to see in the future, eventually. Now, regulatory institutions and institutional frameworks, well, they need to build conducive business environments, raise productivity and reduce competition barriers, trade integration between these countries, review labor regulations, especially for foreign laborers who work in these countries, adequate access to finance and supporting of small and medium enterprises. But what about the public sector? How can the public sector actually facilitate the private sector? Well, wages have to be comparable between public and private sector. It is always a problem in the GCC region and in oil exporting Arab countries. People who work for the public sector, they get more paid than those working in the private sector. There is an excess in public employment. This also has to be balanced with nationalization policies like Emiratization, Saudification, or even Iraqization. Steer education towards the skills needed in the private sector, very important. Employer of last resort schemes, fair and competitive public procurement policies are also important. So this is where we go back again to transparency. And of course, public-private partnerships and joint ventures as a long-term solution. But what about planning for, so I will need just 2 minutes and I'm done. What about planning for a diversified economy? One of the biggest problems that we have in the Middle East is understanding the difference between income diversification and economic diversification. So one of them requires taking some of that money and reinvesting it even outside the region in order to get revenues. And the other one requires lots of work, as we have showed before, different framework, business environment that has to be created, and the specific sectors to be targeted. And on that last point, what the region is looking into right now is picking the next winning sectors. So digitization, logistics, these kind of sectors, these are the sectors where the region needs to look into. And this is where we see opportunities of vertical, horizontal, and global integration. The region is in a very good place in the world. It is interconnected, and it has that potential. And the other goal is to attract FDI to these non-oil sectors. Now, there are some ambitious plans. You look at New Kuwait Policy 2050, spearheaded by Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah. Then you have Vision 2030, spearheaded by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. But eventually for the region, there are energy opportunities, integration of electricity markets. This is something we see with Iraq and the GCC. They are working on it. Oil and natural gas pipelines, especially now we see that Iraq, Egypt, Jordan are working on creating that capacity. And cross-border renewable energy projects. There are lots of opportunities there. But also, the region needs to think beyond itself. It needs to think how it can be a connecting point between East and West, between Central Asia and Europe, and between the different actors in the world. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Yesar. It was a high-quality speech from your side. I will say that you are ready to be a minister in a pan-Arabic high authority in the coming years with this governmental program.
I might say no.
Thank you again. I will give the floor now to, in the same field, to Alexandre. Alexandre will have this global view on the Middle East and its economic and development perspective in comparison with other parts of the world. And especially, I know it will focus on this this part of the renewable energy in the economic sector. Alexandre, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Eric. I must say, I really enjoyed the presentations that were delivered by the other speakers, because it really comforts me in what I've think over all these years, and what I've developed as a thesis in my book. Actually, if you want me to resume the thesis of my book, is that the Middle East and North Africa region needs to undergo a triple transition. The first transition is quite obvious. It is the institutional transition, because there is a very important governance gap in this region, as has been shown also in other presentations. And this needs to be overcome with different measures and with a change of mind in the policies actually that have to be implemented. I think there is really this kind of disruption in thinking in the public service that needs to be to happen in this region from Morocco to Iraq. And in my book, I developed some positive examples where actually this government's revolution has started. Obviously, a country like the United Arab Emirates is really ahead of the pack, but it is also related to a host of factors that are very specific to the Emirates that cannot be easily transposed to other countries. You cannot create a Dubai in every other Arab country, for example. It's impossible, but you can take some lessons from the Emirati experience that you can transpose to other countries. And the Emirati experience, actually, what I show in my book, which is not a secret anyway, it has taken a lot of experiences itself and lessons from the Far East, and especially from the Singaporean experience. If you read the history of the Emirates, you can see that Sheikh Zayed, who was the founder of the Emirates, the co-founder with the other emirs, actually sent whole delegations to Singapore in the 70s and 80s to study the the Singaporean experience. And to try to catch the key drivers which make this experience worth transposing. And actually, one of the key features is the quality of the public service and the meritocratic orientation of the public service. You don't put people in positions because they are related to this or that, political leader or whatever, or tribal leader, but you put them because of their skills. And I think this is what the Emirates got right, also because they had this legacy of the British civil service. That is actually one of the best in the world, and that was transposed in the country after it gained independence. And you can find this in other GCC countries, but to a lesser extent, in a way. So this first revolution that has to be implemented. The second revolution is the technological revolution. And it has been mentioned also, and it's very important indeed when we look at R&D spending in the region, as has been said by Amro, for example. It's very low. It's very low on a global basis. And it's very low related to the size of the economy, to the GDP. It's below 1% of GDP on average in the region. You have some countries that are trying to develop these new orientations. Once again, you have the Emirates. You have also Saudi Arabia, which has invested a lot from the time of late King Abdullah in this orientation, which created some scientific institutions of excellence, which were quite missing in this part of the world, with the like of the King Abdullah University for Science and Technology, KAUST, for example, and other institutions in the same vein. And you also have some much more poorer countries like Morocco, for example, that has made some strides in this field. And if you look at spending on R&D in Morocco, it's far above the regional average. And this is something that is encouraging, but this has to be developed much further. And one obvious area where it could be developed, as was mentioned by Yesar, is the digital economy and the digital technologies, where actually this could be a leapfrogging technology, a technology that could enable this region to make a leapfrog. And as was mentioned in the report by my friend Rabah Areski, who is now chief economist of the African Development Bank, and who was previously in charge of the MENA region at the World Bank, was the chief economist for the, and he published in 2018, I think, a very interesting report called the Moonshot, that the region should make a moonshot and should, try to put a lot of effort in this kind of catalytic initiatives. So this is also something I developed in my book. And the third revolution is what we are talking about in this seminar, is the environmental revolution, the environmental transition, how to move from high carbon to low carbon economies in the region. And this is obviously one of the major challenges, which has been for many years overlooked. Why it has been overlooked? Because of this abundance of natural resources, of fossil energy, that made it easier for governments, to simply run their economies based on these resources. In the power sector, for example, where you have the share of fossil resources that is still very, very high. I can show you one chart actually that I just made while I was listening to the other speakers. Mm-hmm. So just 1 second. So you see in this chart, I don't know if you see it, yeah. But you can see here the share of renewable electricity output, of total electricity output. There is a similar chart in Amro's presentation, but I think this gives you a good, benchmarking of what can be achieved. Basically, for example, you can see a country like Brazil, which is a world champion in renewable energy, with 70% of its, more than 70% of its electricity coming from renewable energy. And this is thanks in many, mostly to its hydro power resources. Which the other countries in the world don't have necessarily, but it shows you that renewable energy can actually be a very important component in the electricity mix. You have other countries like Japan, for example, Germany, which has moved in this direction very aggressively. especially since 2011 with the Fukushima catastrophe in Japan, the nuclear catastrophe, and Germany changed radically its energy policy, the so-called Energiewandel, the energy transformation, with this focus on eliminating fossil fuels and eliminating nuclear energy from its electricity mix by 2030 or 2040. And it's moving in this direction. Now, if you look at countries in the Middle East, actually, you can see that the leader is not a rich country, it is Morocco. And this comes also out of necessity, because Morocco doesn't have these fossil fuel resources that are abundant in other countries, like its neighbor Algeria, for example. And Morocco has developed very aggressively its renewable energy infrastructures. And you have, for example, one of the largest solar plants in the world that has been set up in Ouarzazate, called the Noor power plant. And you also have now other replicates of the same technology that are being spread all over Morocco. It also invested in wind, in offshore wind, and now you can see that Morocco generates almost 20%. This chart is from 2014, but now it's closer to 20% or even more of its total electricity generation, and 40%, I think 40-45% of its capacity, of installed capacity, which is not the same as the electricity that is actually generated. Because, as you know, solar and wind energies are intermittent, and they don't allow you to have a 24/7 day electricity generation. But overall, there has been a lot of progress. You can see, in contrast, the GCC countries, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are still very much, as has been said, inexistent in this field. Although there are some interesting projects that have been implemented in the UAE in relation with the Masdar Institute, which is a research institute created in Abu Dhabi, and which is really trying to act as a catalyst of this energy transition in the UAE and in the broader region. So you have solar installations, utility scale solar plants that have been created over the last few years. And the elephant in the room, obviously, is Saudi Arabia, where we expect there to be much more effort than is currently done. There have been a lot of announcements as of late, starting from Vision 2030, about this shift to renewable energy, and with dozens of gigawatts of energy to be installed by 2030. But for the time being, actually, we must say that it has been quite disappointing. Which alludes me to a key point, which is the institutional capability. The institutional capability, which is related to this governance evolution that I talked about. And I think it is one of the key hurdles now, one of the critical bottlenecks that have to be overcome. Because there is a gap between what political leaders want to achieve, and we can trust them to be sincere about what they want to achieve. For example, someone like Mohammed bin Salman or any other leaders. But actually, on the ground, the administration really struggles to implement these visions because of this lack of institutional capabilities on the ground, because the projects are lost in the sense of bureaucracy, And I think there is really a need to work on this specific area. I know that the Global Diwan is holding a seminar on Saudi Arabia, so I will not, speak more about this, but I think Saudi Arabia is really the laboratory for the future of the energy transition in the Arab world and in the MENA region. And what will happen there will have tremendous implications for the other countries, for a country like Algeria, for example, as well, which I know quite well, and which is lagging behind in terms of renewable energies because of this lack of institutional capabilities, and because also of political factors. The political factor here is the social acceptability of higher costs for electricity, for example, of higher tariffs. Because if we look at Algeria, for example, the tariffs on electricity are quite a fraction of the global average or even of the regional average. And when you consider like countries in the GCCs, there have been some efforts actually over the last few years, starting from 2015, 2016, to implement these reforms to make tariffs more relevant to the underlying economics of power generation. But in countries like Algeria, it is still lagging behind. So overall, what it tells you is that there is a need of political will, but also of institutional capabilities on the ground in order to accelerate this energy transition. The last point, perhaps, that I want to mention in this overview is the regional integration dimension. It has been also mentioned, for example, with the interconnections in electricity transmission. I think there is here something that has to be solved, because for 50 or 60 or 70 years, these countries have been talking of regional integration. And so far, if we accept the GCC, which have achieved some kind of integration, although it can still be improved, but the other countries are not in the picture. And there is a need to see what has been done wrong and how this can be corrected. Because if you want to develop a geo-economic and geopolitical vision for the region, you have really to tackle the real problems and to solve these problems.
Thank you, Alexandre, for your comments. It's one of the purpose of the Global Diwan to get this interconnection and this dialogue between different countries from East and West. You mentioned our next webinar on Saudi Arabia. It will be hosted on December the 10th, but we'll provide you with information about doing business in Saudi Arabia and in foreign investment and the capacity of modernization in Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about with distinguished panelists. It's time now to close, or we are ready to close this webinar, but I will appreciate to give the possibility of speaking again 2 or 3 minutes to our panelists. Amro, Mona, Yesar, are you ready to comment what has been said? Do you have a sort of transition or a conclusion that you will share with our speakers, with other speakers, and with the audience? Maybe Yesar, you will start.
Thank you very much, Eric and everybody. Just to start from the last point that Alexander put out, economic integration in the region and interconnection. So electricity interconnection is quite an interesting sector to look at, because the GCC have something called the GCCIA, which is their interconnection authority. Recently, what we have seen is Iraq has signed an agreement with the GCCIA to import, at the first stage, 500 megawatts of electricity from the GCC market at market prices. And that is going to be expanded with upcoming stages to 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of electricity. And this is important for Iraq, especially in the summer, when you know, temperature goes all the way to 50 degrees centigrade and electricity is not widely available. The same way we can see with the Saudis opening up to Iraq. Yesterday, Iraq and Saudi opened the land port Arar, which is in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, southern part of Iraq, and this has been closed for the last 25-30 years since Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. So these are all interesting, positive economic strides. The Saudis also are interested in investing into Iraq's economic different sectors, food production, electricity production, oil and gas, especially gas capture and processing. As you may know, Iraq is the second largest gas flaring country after Russia in the world, and that puts around $7 billion, you know, in the air being burnt every year. So this is the same kind of policy that Saudi has with Egypt, for instance. So many of the projects that we see in Egypt in terms of the new economic capital, in terms of the infrastructure projects, housing, even some of that energy sector investment is actually done by proxy for Saudi and Emirati companies, who also, utilizing project finance schemes, bring in lots of equity and debt from Chinese organizations, Chinese banks, and also international financial organizations, which is very positive by the end of the day. So we see something happening of this sort with Iraq at the moment. Now, very important to highlight here on Alexander's point is, although we see all of this economic integration, but this is mostly politically driven. So for instance, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia sees a long-term ally that is an important military partner in facing Iran. At the same time, they see that in Iraq, to counter the Iranian influence, which is quite strong in the country, they have to do it by entering the country economically. So there are prospects of economic integration. If you take the politics out of it, these prospects are going to be much more widespread and better in a way. But again, the politics are mixed into that, and this kind of slows down things. So this is the only point I wanted to make. One technical point on that graph that Alexander showed, it shows Iraq with a high level of renewable energy production. Well, that mostly comes from hydropower. These numbers are a bit old because when ISIS took over Mosul, they took down much of that production, especially in the Mosul Dam and other places. So that's the only other technical point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yesar. Mona, Amro, you want to conclude very shortly, please, because we arrived to our 1 hour and 15 minutes established time. But if you have nothing to add, or we would like to thank you again for your contribution for this wide panel with different countries, different speakers, different way of thinking. But we see that we share some common ideas that Alexandre has well expressed in this need for, of course, toward a low carbon economy, but with more research and development and more integration in the MENA zone. according to what Yesar said, we will have to hold another webinar speaking on China, of India, on Iran, on even the African continent, in connection with this Middle East, Gulf countries, and Levant area. But it's another story, I will say. And I just give you appointment to our next webinar on Saudi Arabia. You are, of course, most welcome. And thank you again to the audience, and thank you again to you, friends and panelists. Have a great day, and see you soon with the Global Diwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for the Global Diwan for organizing this webinar.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you,
Amro. Your technical explanations were very useful at the beginning, because we are not specialists. We are economists or lawyers. We are general.
Eric, I just want to add one thing. I always tell to my friends, it's very easy to close the tap of oil, but it's difficult to open it back. Yeah. So we will, when the world is ready for more oil, it's going to be struggle.
Okay. Thank you for the last word, Amro.
Okay.
Goodbye, everybody.